23, my Amish wife asked why I married her. I couldn't tell her the truth. Don't tell her it was the tea. That's what my grandfather said. Standing in the doorway of the kitchen with his suspenders half off his shoulders, kerosene lamp throwing his shadow long across the wall behind him. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the brown glass bottle on the table, the one with the valerian and the skull cap and something else he never named, something he grew behind the woodshed where Ma'am couldn't see it. Rebecca was upstairs, sleeping finally. First time in 11 days she'd slept more than 40 minutes straight. I could still hear the sound her breathing made when the coughing stopped. This thin, wet pull, like cloth tearing under water. Gross-Daddy wiped his hands on his trousers. His right hand. Always his right hand. And he said it again, quieter. She doesn't need to know what pulled her back. I was 24 years old, married 14 months, and I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a cup of tea I'd brewed from a recipe my grandfather kept folded inside a German Bible. Not the family Bible, a different one, the one with the cracked spine and no cover. And I didn't know if what I'd just done made me a healer or a liar. I remember my hands. I remember they smelled like the root, earthy, almost sweet, the way damp soil smells under a log in October. I remember thinking, if this works, she'll ask me why I married her, and I won't be able to tell her the whole truth. Not yet. Maybe, no, not maybe. I wasn't ready. I was 24. I didn't know what I carried. Quick pause. My name is Joseph, and this is Rebecca's husband. If these stories stay with you, if they remind you of something the old ones knew, subscribe. It's free, and it's the reason I can keep telling them. Tell me in the comments, did anyone in your family carry a remedy they wouldn't explain? Something that worked but nobody talked about? And if you want to go further, a super chat or a membership, that's you telling me these old ways are worth remembering. That keeps this going. Now, back to what happened. Rebecca didn't grow up in my church district. She came from a settlement 2 counties over, near the eastern edge of Lancaster, where the farms sat closer together and the bishops held tighter to the old ordnung. In her family, you didn't go to English doctors. That wasn't written down anywhere, not in the way outsiders think of rules. It was more like gravity. You didn't question it because you didn't think to question it. The body got sick, the body got well, and in between, you used what God put in the ground. That's what her grandmother believed. That's what her mother believed, and that's what Rebecca carried into our marriage like a hope chest nobody opened in front of me. I learned later that her grandmother, her gross mammy, Hannah, kept a garden behind the wash house with 37 plants in it, and not one of them was decorative, comfrey for the bones, mullein for the lungs, yarrow to stop bleeding, chamomile for the nerves, valerian root for what Hannah called the night terrors. She didn't use that phrase the way a doctor would. She meant something simpler. She meant the body won't rest because the body knows something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. That's what the old ones knew. In our home, my parents' home, where I grew up, it was quieter than that. Dad didn't talk about remedies. He just did things. If one of us boys had a fever, Ma'am would press a cloth soaked in apple cider vinegar to our feet and temples. If we had a cough that wouldn't break, Dat would slice an onion, set it on the wood stove with a spoonful of sugar, and collect the syrup that oozed out by morning. He never said, "This is medicine." He just handed it to us. The learning was in the watching. I remember being maybe 9, standing in the kitchen doorway. I still had my barn boots on. I remember because Ma'am told me twice to take them off, and I didn't. And I watched Dat crush dried peppermint between his palms and drop it into a pot of water that was just barely trembling on the stove. Not boiling. Trembling. He said, "Too hot kills it. You want it warm enough to wake it up." That's the only instruction he ever gave me about any of it. I almost asked him once, I was maybe 12, what else he knew. But the thing is, in our community, a son doesn't press his father. You wait. You watch, and if he wants you to carry it, he'll hand it to you when you're ready. Rebecca and I were married in November. She was 22, I was 23. Her father, Amos, shook my hand at the wedding meal and held it a second longer than he needed to. He looked at me, not unkind, but measuring, like he was checking if the wood was sound before he trusted the beam. I didn't understand that look for years. I thought it was just a father giving away his daughter. It wasn't. Amos knew something about Rebecca's health that I didn't. Not a sickness exactly, more like a tendency. Her lungs had always been narrow. That was the word her mother used, narrow. And every winter since she was 14, a cough would settle into her chest like it had leased the space and didn't intend to leave. Most years it passed in a week or two, but the year she was 17, no, wait, 18, she was 18, it didn't pass. It stayed for 6 weeks and took 9 pounds off her frame before Hannah's tea finally broke it loose. Amos knew this. Her mother, Mary, knew this. Rebecca knew this. Nobody told me. I don't think they meant harm by it. I think they believed if they handed her to a good man, a man who worked hard and kept a warm house, the cough wouldn't come back. I think they believed love was a kind of medicine. And maybe it is. But it's not the only kind. Our first winter together was mild. Almost no snow until January, and even then it melted fast. The house stayed warm. Rebecca sang while she worked. Not hymns exactly, half hymns, pieces of songs her grandmother had hummed while grinding roots in that garden behind the wash-house. I didn't know what the songs were. I just knew the sound of them made the kitchen feel like it had always been ours. She was strong that winter, color in her face, steady hands. I actually let myself think that whatever had troubled her lungs before was behind us, that our home had cured it, that I had cured it just by being there. I was 23 years old, and I believed that a man's presence could keep sickness out of a house, like a locked door keeps out the cold. I carried that belief the way you carry a lantern in a dark barn. It felt like enough light. It wasn't. The second winter came early. First frost hit the 3rd week of September. I remember because I lost the last of the basil, the whole row along the south wall of the garden, and Rebecca stood at the window and said, "That's not right. That's too soon." October was wet, the kind of wet that doesn't dry. The barn with the second beam, Dad had to brace after the storm of '94. That barn leaked in 3 places I'd never seen water before. The fields stayed muddy through November, and somewhere in the 2nd week of November, Rebecca started coughing. Not bad at first, a dry, tight sound, like a hinge that needed oil. She waved it off. "It's just the damp," she said. She brewed herself chamomile with honey the way her mother had taught her. She drank it twice a day. She kept working. She kept singing, though the songs got shorter. By the end of November, the cough had changed. It had weight to it now, a thickness. She'd bend over the sink, and I could hear something deep in her chest shifting, like gravel settling at the bottom of a bucket. She stopped singing. She didn't mention it. Neither did I. That's how silence works in a plain house. It doesn't announce itself. It just fills the space where something used to be. The first week of December, Rebecca couldn't sleep lying down. She'd prop herself up with 3 pillows, then 4, and still I'd wake at 2, 3 in the morning to the sound of her fighting for air. Her lips had a color I'd never seen on a living person. Not blue exactly, but the memory of blue, like the sky just before full dark. I brought her tea. I brought her steam, boiling water with eucalyptus oil and peppermint, the way Ma'am had done for us boys. I rubbed her back with camphor until my hands burned. Nothing held. The cough would quiet for an hour, maybe 2, and then come back worse, like it was angry I'd tried. By the 9th day, she couldn't eat more than a few bites of broth. Her collarbones stood out like the edge of a plow, and her eyes, give me a second, her eyes looked at me like she was already apologizing for something she hadn't done yet. I didn't know what to do. The remedies I knew, the small ones, the kitchen ones, the ones you learn by watching, they weren't enough. I thought about calling for an English doctor. I stood at the phone shanty at the end of the lane for 11 minutes. I know because I counted the drips from the roof onto the frozen mud. 11 minutes. And I couldn't pick up the phone. Not because of the Ordnung. Not because the bishop would have disapproved. Our district wasn't that strict about doctors. Not for something serious. I couldn't pick it up because I didn't know what to say. My wife is coughing and I can't fix it. A man isn't supposed to say that. A man is supposed to know what to do with his hands. That's what I believed. That's what I'd watched Dat believe. So I drove the buggy instead. 3 miles in the dark, the horse's breath making clouds in the lantern light, to my grandfather's house. Gross-Daddy was 71. No, 72. Dad always told me to get that right. He was sitting at his kitchen table when I came in, reading from that German Bible with no cover, the one that smelled like pipe smoke and dried lavender. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked like he'd been waiting. He closed the book and put his hand flat on the table, his left hand, palm down, fingers spread, and he said, "Tell me what her breathing sounds like. Not what's wrong, not is she sick." He wanted to know the sound. So I told him. I said it sounded like wet cloth tearing. He nodded once, then he stood up and went to the back of the house, to a room I'd only been in twice in my life, a small room off the root cellar, cooler than the rest of the house, with shelves lined in brown glass bottles and dried bundles hanging from the ceiling beams. The smell in that room, I can still call it up if I close my eyes. Green and sharp and old, like the earth was breathing through the walls. He came back with 3 things: a bottle of dark liquid, the valerian tincture I'd later learned to make myself, a small cloth pouch of dried mullein leaves, soft as felt between your fingers, and a folded piece of paper, brown at the edges, written in a hand I didn't recognize. He set them on the table, and he said, "The mullein opens the chest. The valerian lets the body stop fighting itself long enough to heal. And this," he tapped the paper, "this is your gross mammy's recipe. She used it on your father when he was 4, and the whooping cough nearly took him." I didn't know that. Dad never told me he'd been that sick. Gross-Daddy unfolded the paper and read it to me slowly. Mullein, valerian root, a half-spoonful of dried lobelia, honey from our own hives, and hot water, not boiling, just trembling on the stove. "Too hot kills it," he said, and I heard my father's voice come out of his mouth. We drove back together. Gross-Daddy sat beside me in the buggy and didn't speak the whole way. When we got to the house, Rebecca was sitting up in bed, awake, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of chamomile she hadn't finished. She looked at my grandfather, and something crossed her face. Not fear, not relief. Recognition, like she'd seen this before in her own family. He sat on the chair beside the bed, and he listened to her breathe for a full minute without saying a word. Then he looked at me and said, "Make it now, exactly as I told you." I went to the kitchen, I boiled the water and pulled it off the heat. I measured the mullein, 1.5 pinches, he'd said, not a full 2 pinches. I crumbled the lobelia between my fingers, and it smelled like pepper and something metallic, something I couldn't name. I added the valerian, dark as molasses, the honey last. I stirred it with a wooden spoon. Not metal, Gross-Daddy had said. Never metal. The old ones didn't use metal with these plants. The tea was the color of wet bark. I carried it upstairs. My hands were shaking. Not from the cold. Rebecca drank it in small sips. She made a face at the taste. Lobelia is bitter, a bitterness that sits on the back of your tongue and doesn't leave. But she drank it. All of it. Gross-Daddy sat in the chair and watched her the way you watch a fire you've just lit, checking if it'll catch. 20 minutes passed. 30. Her breathing didn't change. I stood by the window and I thought, this is the moment where I should have called the English doctor. This is where the old ways fail. And then, I don't know how to describe it exactly, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where she gasped and sat up and the color rushed back. It was smaller than that. The space between her coughs got longer. 3 minutes, then 5, then 8. Her shoulders, which had been up near her ears for days, dropped 1/2 inch. Her eyes closed. Not the tight fighting kind of closed, the letting go kind. Gross-Daddy put his hand on my arm, his right hand, the one with the scar across the knuckle from a farrier's blade, and he said quietly, "Now you make it again in 4 hours. Same way. Don't change anything." And then he said the other thing, the thing I opened this story with. "Don't tell her it was the tea." I didn't understand why. Not then. I made the tea again at 4 in the morning, and again at 8. By the second day, Rebecca was sleeping in stretches of 2 hours. By the third day, she asked for bread. By the 5th day, she was sitting up on her own, and the color in her face wasn't the memory of blue anymore. It was pink, a live pink, and on the 11th night she slept through until morning. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched her breathe the way Gross Daddy had watched the tea, checking if it would hold. It held, but I didn't tell her what was in it. Not exactly. I said mullein and honey. I left out the lobelia. I left out the valerian. I left out the folded paper and the room behind the root cellar, and the fact that my grandfather had carried this recipe for 40 years and never told my father where it came from. What I didn't know, what neither of us understood, was that lobelia was a plant the English doctors had fought over for 100 years. Some called it medicine, some called it poison. In large doses, it can make you vomit, make your heart race, make your breathing worse, not better. What Gross Daddy knew, what the paper taught him, was the dose. 7 drops of the tincture. Not 8, not 6, 7. And he knew to pair it with the valerian, which slowed the body's panic, and the mullein, which loosened what the lungs were holding. He knew because his mother knew, and she knew because the browser in their district, an old man named Ezra who kept bees and spoke to his plants in Deech, had taught her when she was 17, and her own brother was sick with the same wet, heavy cough. The knowledge moved in a chain, woman to man to woman. That's how browserai works. It crosses, it alternates, it never passes straight down. And my grandfather kept this to himself not because he was secretive by nature, but because he understood something I didn't yet. If Rebecca knew the full remedy, she'd want to use it herself. And without the years of watching, without understanding that the difference between healing and harm was a single drop, the knowing could become dangerous. He wasn't hiding the truth. He was holding it until I was ready to carry it right. That's what the old ones knew. Rebecca got stronger through December. By Christmas, she was back in the kitchen, rolling out dough for the shoofly pies, flour on her forearms up to the elbow. She moved slower than before, careful, like someone walking on a floor they'd fallen through once and didn't fully trust yet, but she was there, and I watched her the way I'd watched Dat work with his hands when I was a boy, quietly, from the edge of the room, memorizing what I couldn't name. I kept making the tea every night. Not the full remedy, just the mullein and honey, the safe parts, the parts that couldn't hurt anyone. I'd bring it to her and she'd drink it without asking what was in it, the way you accept what someone hands you when you trust them. And every time she took the cup from me, I felt 2 things at once. Relief that she was well. And a weight I couldn't set down, the weight of knowing something about her body that she didn't know about her own. I told myself it was protection. That's what men do, isn't it? We carry what others shouldn't have to. That's what I told myself. I think I believed it. I don't know if I knew what belief really was yet. The cough came back the next winter. Milder, but it came. And the winter after that. Every year, somewhere between late October and the first real freeze, I'd hear it start. That dry, tight sound, the hinge, and I'd go to the kitchen before she asked. By the 3rd year, I didn't need the paper anymore. I had it memorized the way Gross Daddy had it memorized. Mullein, a pinch and a half. Valerian, dark and slow. Lobelia, 7 drops. Honey from our hives, always our hives, because Gross Daddy said the bees that know your land make medicine the body recognizes. I don't know if that's science. I know it's what he said. And I know it worked. Every year the tea pulled her through. Every year I didn't tell her the whole of what was in it. It became a rhythm. Like milking. Like prayer. Something you do with your hands, because your hands know it, even when your mind has wandered somewhere else. I thought I was being a good husband. I thought carrying a secret for someone's sake was the same as love. I actually thought this, that as long as I kept making the tea, nothing could go wrong that I couldn't fix. I was 27 when I thought that. Funny how certainty feels like wisdom when you're young. It's not. It's just the silence before the question comes. The question came from my brother Levi. He was 2 years younger than me, broader in the shoulders, quieter in the mouth. Levi didn't talk much. When he did, it landed. We were in the barn one afternoon, February, cold enough that the water in the trough had a skin of ice I had to break with my elbow, and he said, without looking up from the harness he was mending, "Sarah's been coughing since New Year's." Sarah was his wife, married the spring after Rebecca and me. I stopped what I was doing. I didn't ask how bad. I didn't need to. Levi's hands were still on the leather, but his thumbs weren't moving. That's how I knew. I said, "Does it sound wet?" He nodded. "Does she sleep sitting up?" He nodded again, and then he said quieter, "Dat's onion syrup isn't touching it." I stood there in that barn with the frozen water and the horses breathing steam, and I realized that what I carried wasn't just mine, it was Levi's now too. Or it needed to be, but Grossdaddy had told me the recipe passes from a man to a woman, not man to man. I couldn't teach Levi the way I'd been taught, so I made the tea for Sarah myself, brought it over in a mason jar wrapped in a towel to keep it warm, told Levi to give her a cupful every 4 hours, no more, no less. He took the jar and looked at me and said, "What's in it?" And I said, "Mullein and honey." Same thing I told Rebecca. The same half-truth, passed sideways like a plate at a Sunday meal. There was a man in our district, older than my father, named Eli Stoltzfus. Worked the farm 3 properties north of ours, the one with the stone wall along the road that had been there since before anyone could remember who laid it. Eli lost his first wife, Anna, the winter of '98, pneumonia. She was 36 years old, and by the time they got her to the English hospital in Lancaster, her lungs were so full of fluid, the doctors said there was nothing modern medicine could have done, even if she'd come 2 weeks earlier. That's what they told Eli. Whether it was true or whether they were being kind, I don't know. What I do know is that Eli told my father, sitting at our kitchen table on a Thursday evening with a cup of coffee he never drank, that Anna had been coughing since October, and he'd treated it with chamomile and steam and prayer, and he'd believed it was enough. He said, and I was in the next room, I wasn't supposed to hear this, but the walls in our house were thin as hymnal pages. He said, "I did what I knew. It just wasn't what she needed." Dat didn't answer. He put his hand on Eli's shoulder and left it there. That was the answer. I was 19 when I heard that. I carried it for years before I understood what it cost Eli to say it out loud. And I carried something else, too. The question of whether what I knew, what Grossdaddy had given me, could have helped Anna. I'll never know. That's the kind of wondering that doesn't have a bottom. You just fall through it, slowly, for the rest of your life. 4 winters later, Rebecca was 29. The children had come by then. Our son Daniel was 3, and our daughter Hannah, named for Rebecca's grandmother, the one with the 37 plants, was 14 months. It was a hard winter. Snow in early November that didn't melt until March. The kind of cold that finds every crack in the house and sits there like it's been invited. Rebecca's cough came early that year, and it came different, deeper. There was a sound underneath it I hadn't heard before, a whistle, thin and high, like wind through a keyhole. I made the tea. Same recipe, same proportions. Mullein, valerian, 7 drops of lobelia, our honey. She drank it, and for the first time in 5 years, it didn't work the way it always had. The space between coughs didn't lengthen. Her shoulders didn't drop. She slept an hour, maybe, then woke gasping. And the look in her eyes was the one I hadn't seen since that first winter, the apology look. The look that said she was sorry her body was failing in a house I'd tried to keep warm enough. I drove to Grossdaddy's house. He was 76, moving slower that year, his hands stiffer in the mornings, the knuckles swollen in a way that made him hold his coffee cup with both palms. I told him the tea wasn't working. He listened. He asked me to describe the sound again, not the cough, the sound underneath it. The whistle. He closed his eyes and was quiet so long I thought he'd fallen asleep. Then he said, "That's not the lungs, that's the tightness around the lungs." He went to the back room, slower this time, one hand on the wall, and came back with a different bottle. Smaller, darker glass. The liquid inside was almost black. "Lobelia and black cohosh," he said. "Your grossmammy made this for the tightness. Not the cough, the tightness. They're not the same thing, and you can't treat them the same way." He measured the dose into a spoon, smaller than before, maybe 5 drops, and said, "This one, you give her once. Only once. Then you wait 12 hours. If the whistle stops, you go back to the tea. If it doesn't stop," he paused, "you take her to the English doctor." He said it plain, no shame in his voice, no defeat, just a man who knew where his knowledge ended and wasn't afraid of the border. I gave Rebecca the black cohosh tincture that night. She made the same face she always made with lobelia, the bitterness pulling her mouth to one side, and she lay back on the pillows. I sat in the chair beside the bed. I didn't sleep. I listened. 3 hours passed. The cough continued, but the whistle, I leaned closer. I held my breath to hear better. The whistle was softer. By morning, it was gone. Not the cough. The cough was still there, stubborn as a rusted hinge. But that thin, high sound underneath had dissolved, and when I put my hand on Rebecca's back, I could feel her ribs expanding in a way they hadn't for days. She breathed in, and I felt the breath go all the way down. I went back to the tea. 4 hours apart. Mullein, valerian, 7 drops, our honey. By the 3rd day she was sleeping again. By the 5th she asked for food. By the 7th she was standing at the window watching Daniel try to catch snowflakes on his tongue in the yard, and she laughed. I hadn't heard her laugh in 3 weeks. It sounded like the kitchen used to sound when she sang. That's what the old ones knew, that healing isn't one thing. It's a conversation between the body and whatever you bring to it, and sometimes you have to change what you're saying. It was spring when she asked me. April. The snow was gone and the fields were that particular shade of green that only lasts a week. Electric, almost painful, the color of everything trying to be alive at once. We were sitting on the porch after supper. The children were asleep. She had a cup of regular tea in her hands, just chamomile, nothing hidden, and she looked out at the fields and said, "Joseph, why did you marry me?" I thought she was asking something simple. I started to answer the simple way. Because I loved her. Because she was good. Because her father's handshake told me she came from people who meant what they said. But she cut me off. "No," she said. "I mean, did you know about my lungs before you married me? Did somebody tell you?" And I understood then that she'd been carrying her own question all these years, wondering if I'd married her in spite of the cough, or because of it, or without knowing it existed. Wondering if she'd been handed to me like a problem dressed in a wedding dress. I looked at her. I wanted to tell her everything. The tea, the lobelia, the room behind the root cellar, the folded paper, the 7 drops, the chain of knowing that went from Ezra the Broucher to my grandmother, to my grandfather, to me. I wanted to tell her that I didn't marry her because she was sick, and I didn't marry her despite it. I married her because standing in my grandfather's kitchen at 24, with my hands smelling like valerian root, I understood for the first time that love is not the absence of trouble, it's the willingness to learn the remedy. But I couldn't say all that. Not yet. The words weren't, I don't have a way to explain it. The words were there, but they were shaped wrong. Too big for my mouth. So I said, "I married you because your grandmother grew 37 plants, and not one of them was decorative." Rebecca looked at me. She didn't understand, but she smiled. And that was enough for that night. If you're watching this, and you grew up somewhere your grandfather's hands knew more than the doctor's degree, I see you. If you carry a recipe nobody wrote down, or if you lost one because nobody thought to pass it on, I see you. If you're still inside the community, making the tea the way you were taught, measuring by feel, because that's how it was given to you, I see you. If you left, and some nights the smell of dried mullein or the taste of raw honey stops you in the middle of a grocery store aisle and you can't move for a second, I see you too. If you're English and something in your chest pulls toward a simpler way of knowing the body, a way that doesn't start with a prescription pad, I see you. If you lost someone that maybe a different kind of knowledge could have helped, I'm not going to tell you it would have saved them. I don't know that. But I see you carrying it, and you are not alone. Tell me in the comments, is there a remedy your family carried? Something your grandmother made? Something your father mixed in the kitchen when he thought nobody was watching? I want to hear it. Write it down. Because that's how these things survive. Not in books, not in bottles, but in the telling. There is so much more I haven't said yet. There are remedies I haven't been ready to share, but I'm getting closer. If you want to be here when I do, subscribe to Rebecca's Husband. This is where the old ways get to breathe again. And if a super chat or a membership feels right to you, that's you saying this chain doesn't have to break. That's you saying the knowing is worth keeping. I carry that, and I carry you. The remedy was always in the listening.